If someone followed your money, where would they go? What would they see? If money talks, what is yours saying? Let's talk about it. Well, hey, welcome back. I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I am so glad you're with me. Now, when you walk into a church, you probably have an idea of what to expect. You don't have to be a church person to know the script. There's going to be songs, a sermon, prayer, offering. I mean, that's how church has been done forever. But it wasn't always like that. When the first church started in the first century, the church people didn't know how to be churching. Jesus said that they would be his witnesses to the world, but there were no instructions in the package. They had no blueprints. And so they had to start this whole movement, this whole church movement from scratch. Put yourself in their shoes. Like, if you really love Cool Whip, and the CEO of Cool Whip calls you and he says, I'm going to give you $1 million and I want you to start a global movement called the Cool Whip Kids. What do? Do you make a Whippy the Cool Whip Man mascot suit? Do you get a Cool Whip car and drive it all over the country? Do you create a community of whipsters who sing songs about whipped cream and preach sermons about their favorite dessert recipes? I mean, there are 100 ways to be Cool Whip evangelists and start the Cool Whip Kids movement. But which is the right one? Just like the first Christians, you would have to figure it out from scratch. And we've been exploring what the first church did in Acts chapter 2 to see what that witness looked like and what it means for our witness today. And so far, their witness was made up of their experience with God, their stories of Jesus, and the way they lived together in community. Each of these elements was part of how they shared Jesus with the world and how the church spread and grew. They all served as these visible identifiers of the followers of Jesus, and they were public. I have this hoodie. It says Soccer Mommy, and almost every time I wear it, someone asks me what it means. Now, you may not realize this, but I'm actually not a mother who cheers for her kids at all of their games. Soccer Mommy is just a band I like. I identify with them. And this hoodie is a visible indicator to the world that I have great taste in music. Just like some people have great taste in their whipped dairy dessert treats. Just like some people have great taste in Jesus. Well, just like my hoodie, there is another visible identifier that the early church had that we're going to check out. And here's what might surprise you. One of the first things people noticed about Christians wasn't what they believed. It was what they did with their money. Look at Acts chapter 2, verse 44 through 45. And all the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. One of the key identifiers of Jesus' first followers was the way they took care of each other, particularly the way they took care of the poor and those in need. They shared what they had. And let's be super clear on what that was. It was their property. It was their possessions, their money. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, he fleshed this out more in Acts 4:32 through 35. Again, he says, all the believers were united in heart and mind, and they felt that what they owned was not their own. So they shared everything they had. And there were no needy people among them because those who owned land or houses would sell them and bring the money to the apostles to give to those in need. In the first church, people with extra stuff sold it, and nobody lived in need. Everyone had enough, both the wealthier people who gave and the poorer people who needed help. The way they used their resources to care for people in need, it was a visible identifier of the church. It was part of their witness of Jesus to the world. Now, I acknowledge that no one is excited to talk about money in this setting. I'm not. I mean, the modern track record of the church asking for money is spotty at best. It's easy to be cynical about it when you see churches flexing big buildings while people down the street can't pay their rent. It's sticky. And if you struggle with that, I am right there with you. But I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking about how the church today has gotten it wrong. You could Google search that and find it in a minute. I want to talk about how the church then got it right. I want to talk about the value of generosity that so visibly characterized the first Christians by taking a look at where this value came from and the impact that it had on their witness to the world. Now, while the first Christians were trying to figure out what it meant to be the church and to be witnesses, they decided to go back to where everything started, to Jesus. And so they cataloged all of the things that he'd said and done, and they put them together to create a roadmap for how to live like he lived, think like he thought, and do what he taught. And so they wrote down things like Luke 14:13-14, where Jesus said, "But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they can't repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Jesus said this when he was eating dinner at a Pharisee's house, and he was watching the other guests compete for better seats. He's watching them jockey for the places of honor and status. And seeing all this, he said, when you throw banquets like this, don't invite the wealthy and well-connected. Don't invite people who benefit you. Invite people who don't. And the first church remembered that Jesus had said this, and they took it literally. And as a result, everyone had a seat at the common church table, and those who had enough always brought extra for those who didn't. And no one in the church went hungry. They also remembered another teaching of Jesus that we find in Matthew 25:34-40. Jesus said, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world.'" Then he says this, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Jesus isn't describing a belief system here. He's describing a lifestyle that's visible. Feeding the hungry and thirsty, clothing those who don't have enough, caring for the sick, and inviting the stranger, which literally means the foreigner and immigrant, in. These were the people the world valued least. They were labeled sinners, burdens on society, drains on the taxpayer, and a threat to the health and wealth of citizens in good standing. They were the people everyone else avoided. And Jesus said, "Whatever you do for them, you do for me." The first church remembered that Jesus has said this, and they took it literally. And those who were able to sold property to give to the needy among them. There was another story Jesus told they remembered about a man who'd been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. Luke 10:33-37, Jesus said, "But a Samaritan as he traveled came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" Jesus said. And the expert in law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." The early Christians remembered Jesus' story of a Samaritan helping a Jewish man, 2 people who would have considered themselves enemies. And they remembered in the story that the Samaritan bandaged the injured man's wounds, transported him to a place where he could recover, and paid for all of it out of his own pocket without asking for repayment or anything else in return. And I'm absolutely certain that they remembered how Jesus wrapped the story up when he said in Luke 10:37, "Go and do likewise." And that's what they did. Likewise. They lived out the value of generosity that Jesus had taught over and over in so many different ways. They took him literally and seriously in his command to care for the least of these, whatever those people looked like, wherever they came from, and whenever they were in need. It was costly, but it wasn't complicated. They just did what Jesus said to do. Let me tell you a story of how this played out in the early church. In around 260 AD, there was a deacon named Lawrence, and he lived in Rome during the reign of Emperor Valerian. Now, Valerian, he started this cycle of Christian persecution, and he was capturing and beheading church leaders, and then he would confiscate all of their property and money and put it into the imperial treasury. When the Pope at that time was killed, Lawrence realized that the whole church was at risk. And so he began to sell everything that the church had of value and distributed the money to the poor. When the local Roman prefect found out about this, he demanded that Lawrence reclaim all of the church's treasures and then turn them over to the government. Lawrence did the opposite. He used what little time he had to continue liquidating and distributing whatever he could. And when he was finally called before the Roman prefect to hand over all of the church's wealth, he didn't bring money. He brought a group of poor, sick, suffering people, and he presented them to the prefect. And he said this. He said, "Here are the treasures of the church. You see, the church is truly rich, far richer than your emperor." Lawrence was captured and beheaded for defying Rome. But this story isn't about why he stood up to power. It's about how he stood up to power. He didn't use violence or the levers of political influence. He didn't use the church's resources to buy his way out. He stood up to the power of the Roman Empire with generosity. And by redefining true wealth as people in need and redefining true power as how we care for them. Christian generosity wasn't just passive and gentle, it was defiant. And it reshaped the Roman world. 300 years after the church established generosity as part of their witness, a Roman emperor named Julian was embarrassed by it. Because in providing for the poor, the Christians were doing what the Roman government and what the pagan temples weren't doing. And Julian didn't like it. He said this, he said, "It is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, the Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well, that all men see our people lack aid from us." Christians cared for the poor both inside and outside of the church so well that it personally embarrassed the Roman emperor and his empire. They weren't us first. It didn't matter if you were a foreigner, an immigrant, a pagan, or an unbeliever. Everyone benefited from the generosity of the church. When we boil all this down, Christian generosity comes down to this one main idea. Our treasure isn't property, it's people. When you treasure property, you hold it tight, you hoard it, and you use it for yourself because I own it. That's what it's for. But when you treasure people, ownership doesn't matter. What matters is that people are cared for, their needs are met, and that they experience dignity and love that's due to everyone who's made in the image of God. When people become your treasure, your property becomes a means to lift everyone up. Luke put it this way in Acts 4:32 through 35. All the believers were united in heart and mind, and they felt that what they owned was not their own. The early church didn't just believe the right things. They lived as if what they owned was not their own, united in heart and mind, convinced that people were the real treasure, not their property. It wasn't just a change in their budget. It was a change in their hearts and minds. And their generosity, it shook an empire from the gutter all the way to the throne room. Tertullian, who is another one of the church fathers, he put it this way. He said, "Our compassion spends more in the streets than yours does in the temples." Their compassion didn't stay inside the church walls. It spilled into the streets. It disrupted systems and made the Roman Empire uncomfortable. It exposed a society that was built on power, status, and self-preservation, and then it quietly undermined all of that with generosity, dignity, and mercy. Which raises an uncomfortable question for us. If their way of life challenged the Roman Empire, what kind of impact should our generosity have on the American Empire? What would it change if we lived like they did? Would our generosity embarrass a capitalist culture that celebrates wealth while it leaves so many people behind? Would the things that divide us dissipate if people became the true treasure of our country instead of money and power and self-preservation? Would our economy and our politics even make sense if Christians begin to care less about their tax rate and more about the people those taxes could help? If we cared more about our streets than our temples? This question isn't meant to be hypothetical. Kingdom generosity should disrupt human empires because it'll either pull you into the way of Jesus or reveal how deeply consumer culture has shaped you. The real question for you isn't whether you find generosity inspiring. We all do. It's whether someone watching your life would call you generous. Whether your life is marked by open hands or closed fists, by love or fear. Whether property is your treasure or people are. Because when people become your treasure, your money stops being about security and it starts becoming a tool for mercy. And in a culture that's trained to consume and accumulate, a community that gives freely becomes impossible to ignore. So the question isn't whether this vision of giving is beautiful, it's whether you're brave enough to live it and bold enough to let your generosity say something unmistakable about the Jesus that you follow. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.